I was standing in my mother's kitchen when I heard Richard say it, in the calm voice he used when he wanted everyone to listen and no one to question him. "She's not welcome on base anymore. I already made the call." The room didn't stop moving. Plates still clinked. Someone laughed softly like it was a joke that went a little too far, but not far enough to challenge. The smell of roasted chicken hung heavy in the air. Sweet tea sweated on the table. The television was off, but the screen reflected us all frozen in different ways. My hands went cold first. Then my stomach emptied like something had been pulled out of me all at once. I didn't step into the room. I stayed where I was by the sink with my shoulder against the cabinet, listening to my own breathing slow down the way it does when I am trying not to show anything at all. Richard stood at the head of the table with his napkin folded just right. Captain Richard Hale, Army. He liked to be announced even in his own house. Aunt Linda smiled like she didn't know where to put her eyes. Uncle Mark cleared his throat. My mother, Mary Ann, stared at her hands like they were the most interesting thing in the world. Evan leaned back in his chair and finally looked straight at me with that grin he only used when he knew he had won something. "Told you." He didn't say it loud. He didn't need to. I had heard it 1,000 times before in different forms. I was 25 years old, and I had been stationed near Fort Liberty long enough to know the sound of a threat wrapped in authority. Richard doesn't raise his voice. He never did when he was most serious. He spoke the way he did when he wanted the room to accept his version of reality as a fact already decided. He went on talking like I wasn't even there, like I was paperwork, like I was a problem he had already filed away. "You don't get to embarrass this family and still expect access. Not after everything I've done. Not after the calls I've made." Someone chuckled. Aunt Linda shook her head like it was a shame. Uncle Mark muttered something about respect. I stepped into the doorway then, and every face turned just enough to remind me that I was on display. Richard finally looked at me. "There it is," he said. The look. Like I was a recruit who had forgotten her place. "If you step out of line tonight," he said slowly so everyone could hear, "I will make sure you regret it at work." My mother's shoulders tightened. Evan smiled wider. I felt the weight of the room press in, and for a second I thought about saying something sharp, something true. But I didn't. I had learned a long time ago that words were wasted on people who hid behind rank. I watched instead. Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen with the confidence of a man who believed the system bent toward him. He turned slightly away from the table and spoke low, but not low enough. "Yeah, it's done." A pause. "Copy, Captain." The voice on the other end was familiar, too familiar. Richard ended the call and slid the phone back like he had just signed my future away with a signature no one could see. He turned back to me and held out his hand. "Keys. The car is under my name. Insurance, too. Until you learn how to act, you don't need it." I didn't move. He stood up and stepped closer. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Apologize, right now, for disrespecting this family." Every eye in the room was on me. The clock on the wall ticked louder than it should have. I felt my pulse in my throat. I thought about the last 6 years, about the mornings before sunrise, about the rules written down and the ones that were never spoken, about learning when to stay silent and when silence was its own kind of shield. I took one step forward. I didn't apologize. I said nothing at all. I reached into the pocket of my jacket and felt the edge of a folded slip of paper brush my fingers. I didn't pull it out. I didn't need to. The word command was faint on the edge where it had been stamped and folded and unfolded again. I closed my hand around it and let my breath out slowly. I didn't argue. I let the paperwork talk, because when command addressed me differently, the whole room would break in half. I looked at my mother then, and finally she looked up. Her eyes were wet, but she didn't speak. She never did when it mattered most. Richard mistook my silence for surrender. He straightened his shoulders. He always did that when he thought he had won. If you've ever been controlled by someone who hides behind authority, stay with me. I was not afraid in that moment. I was steady. The kind of steady that comes from knowing something the other person does not. I was Hayes, 25, stationed near Fort Liberty, enlisted young, quiet by choice. I did my job. I kept my head down. I did not announce myself at dinner tables. Richard was my stepfather, captain, the kind who liked to remind you of it even when he was off duty. Marianne was my mother. She believed in keeping the peace, even if it meant losing herself. Evan was Richard's son. He learned early how to smile while someone else took the hit. Aunt Linda and Uncle Mark were family in the way that meant they would laugh at the joke, even when the joke cut deep. It was late November, a few days before Thanksgiving. The house was warm, the table was full, and I was being told my life had just been limited by a man who believed rank followed him everywhere. I watched Richard take my keys from the counter himself when I didn't hand them over. He set them beside his plate like a trophy. "You're done," he said softly. "On base, in this house, anywhere that matters." I met his eyes then, and for the first time, he looked uncertain. Just for a second. He didn't know it yet, but he had already stepped into something he did not control. He had made a call. He had spoken my name the wrong way, and somewhere not far from that kitchen, the system he trusted was already deciding how to address me next. I did not learn to stay quiet overnight. That skill was trained into me long before I ever put on a uniform. I was 15 when my mother married Richard Hale and moved us into the house near Fayetteville, where authority was not just respected, but enforced. He brought military discipline home with him like it was part of the furniture. At first, it looked harmless. Set dinner times, lights out rules, shoes lined by the door. But rules have a way of multiplying when the person writing them enjoys being obeyed. Richard spoke in commands even when he was off duty. Sit, stand, answer when spoken to. He checked my phone at night under the excuse of safety. He timed how long I was gone when I walked to the store. He asked questions that were not questions at all, but inspections. Where were you? Who did you talk to? Why did it take this long? My mother, Marianne, would stand nearby, pretending to fold laundry or wipe the counter, while he spoke over her like she was part of the wall. She believed that keeping the peace meant letting him set the terms. I learned quickly that reacting only made things worse. If I argued, he raised his voice. If I cried, he called it manipulation. If I stayed quiet, he smiled like he had won something. The first time I saw him throw something, it was a set of keys. They hit the wall near my head and fell to the floor. He said it was an accident. The second time, it was a plate. It shattered by the sink, and he told me to clean it up and be more respectful. He never hit me. He did not have to. The house learned his moods. The air would change when his truck pulled into the driveway. Conversations shortened. Laughter stopped. My mother learned to agree before he finished his sentences. I learned to watch his hands. There were nights when he slammed doors hard enough to rattle the frames, and told us if we did not calm down, he would call the police for disorderly conduct. Disrespect, he called it, like it was a crime. Evan watched all of this and learned exactly where to stand so he would never be the target. He laughed when Richard mocked me. He repeated the words later like they were jokes. "Lighten up. He's just trying to teach you discipline." That was the phrase everyone used. Discipline. It made everything sound reasonable. By the time I was 16, Richard had started controlling money, too. He decided when my mother could work and where. He decided which friends were appropriate. He decided when the car could be used and by whom. Everything was framed as order, structure, safety. One evening, he printed out a set of rules and taped them to the refrigerator. House rules, he called them. Curfew times, approved routes, phone usage, consequences for violations. It looked like something pulled straight from a training manual. He handed me a pen and told me to sign it. I remember my hand shaking as I wrote my name at the bottom, while he watched to make sure I did not miss a letter. My mother said nothing. Evans smirked. That night, after everyone went to bed, I took a picture of the paper with my old phone and saved it to a folder I named Nothing at All. I did not know why I did it. I only knew that something about having it mattered. That was how it always was. I did not fight him with words. I paid attention. I noticed patterns. I learned how power worked when it was pretending to be protection. Richard liked to remind me that I was lucky. Lucky to live in a house run by someone who understood authority. Lucky he cared enough to correct me. He would say things like, "You will never make it on your own if you cannot follow orders." He said it like a warning and a promise. When I turned 17, the pressure increased. He wanted to choose my path, community college nearby, a job he approved, a future he could monitor. The idea of leaving made him tighten his grip. My phone checks became longer. My questions became interrogations. I learned to answer with as few words as possible. Yes, sir. No, sir. I did not use his title out of respect. I used it to end the conversation faster. Inside, I was learning something else. I was learning the difference between real authority and what I started to think of as borrowed power. Power that only worked as long as everyone agreed to pretend. I did not talk about this out loud. I stored it away the same place I stored the picture of the rules and the memory of where the keys hit the wall. When I turned 18, I packed my bag before sunrise and left a note on the counter for my mother. I chose the military not because I wanted to be like Richard, but because I wanted to learn how authority was supposed to work. Clear lanes, written rules, accountability. I told her I was leaving because I needed space. I did not tell her that staying felt like disappearing. Richard called me that afternoon and told me I would fail. He said I did not have the discipline for it. He said I would be back. I did not answer. That was the first real boundary I ever set, and it was small, but it held. Years later, standing in that same kitchen, listening to him threaten my access and take my keys, I did not react because I had already lived through worse in quieter ways. I had learned that reacting gave him energy. Observation took it away. I had learned to survive by understanding systems instead of challenging them head-on. That was the lesson he never meant to teach me. I learned how to stay still while someone else exposed themselves. I learned how to document instead of explode. I learned how to wait. When people ask why I did not fight back sooner, the answer is simple. I was learning. I was learning that false authority always overreaches, and when it does, it leaves a trail. By the time I stepped onto the bus that took me away from that house at 18, I already knew one thing for certain. I chose the military not to become him, but to make sure no one like him ever decided my life again. The military was not a dream for me. It was a structure. I arrived at basic and then AIT, knowing exactly what I wanted and what I did not. I did not want attention. I did not want shortcuts. I did not want anyone mistaking me for someone chasing praise. I kept my head down and learned the work. The days started early and ended late. Formation before sunrise. PT until my muscles burned in a clean, honest way. Chow hall lines that smelled like coffee and powdered eggs. Barracks rooms that taught you quickly how to live with other people and still keep your boundaries intact. I learned to fold my clothes the same way every time. I learned to keep my boots clean and my mouth shut. I learned when to speak and when silence carried more weight. My instructors did not know my family story, and I did not offer it. To them, I was just Hayes, enlisted, on time, consistent. I did not stand out, and I did not fall behind. That was the point. At my first duty station, the routine settled into something steady. PT in the mornings, work days defined by task lists and check-ins, evenings that belonged to whoever needed to recover in their own way. The barracks were loud and quiet at the same time, music leaking through walls, laughter in one room, someone staring at their phone in another. I watched and learned. I paid attention to how people were evaluated, not by how loud they were, but by how reliable. Who signed the roster? Who checked the box? Who noticed when something was missing and fixed it before it became a problem? Paperwork mattered. That was one of the first real lessons. Sign-in rosters were not just lists, they were proof. Counseling statements were not punishments. They were records. SOPs were not suggestions. They were shields. I learned how to read them and how to follow them so closely that no one could question my lane. I did not rush promotion. I did not ask for favors. I earned trust the slow way. I watched leaders who did it right and leaders who did it wrong. I learned the difference. Through all of this, Richard did not disappear. Distance did not loosen his grip the way I thought it would. He called during duty hours and expected me to answer. He asked for reports like he still had the right. What time did PT start? Who is your NCO? What is your chain of command? He said it casually, but I heard the same tone from the kitchen years before. I answered at first because I did not yet know how not to. Then, one afternoon during a briefing, my phone vibrated in my pocket, and I felt the old tension rise. I waited until the briefing ended and stepped outside. He demanded to know why I had not responded. I looked at the building behind me, and then at the phone in my hand, and something small shifted. I told him I was on duty and I would call later. He raised his voice. I lowered mine. I ended the call. It was a small boundary, almost nothing, but it held. The next time he called during work hours, I did not answer at all. He left messages. He reminded me who he was. He reminded me who he thought I was. I saved the messages and kept doing my job. That was how it went. I did not confront him. I adjusted my behavior. I learned to protect my time the same way I protected my gear. Quietly. Professionally. My supervisors noticed that I did not panic when things went sideways. They noticed that I documented everything. They noticed that I knew where to find the answer instead of guessing. One afternoon, my NCO asked if I could help coordinate for an upcoming readiness inspection. Not lead it, support it. Liaison work, making sure information flowed the way it was supposed to, making sure nothing slipped. It was not glamorous. It was precise. I accepted without comment. There were briefings that were not open to everyone, meetings where names were not repeated. I signed a form acknowledging what I could and could not discuss, and then did the work. Need to know was the phrase everyone used. I did not talk about it at home. I did not talk about it anywhere. It was just another responsibility added to the list. I learned how inspections really worked. Not as punishment, but as correction. Not to destroy careers, but to protect systems. That mattered to me. Somewhere along the way, I realized I was learning exactly what I had come for. Not how to command, but how to understand command. Not how to dominate, but how to move within the rules without being crushed by them. Then the message came through my phone late one evening. Family dinner at Mom's. Captain wants you there. I stared at the screen longer than I needed to. The word captain did not belong in that sentence, but Richard never cared about boundaries. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, and then the steadiness underneath it. I knew what those dinners were. Tests, displays, performances. I also knew something else now. I knew my lane. I knew my limits. And I knew that if he tried to use his rank again, he would not just be wrong. He would be documented. The drive to my mother's house felt longer than it should have, not because the roads changed, but because my body remembered every mile. Fayetteville looked the same in late November. The early dark, the thin cold that was not winter yet, but promised it. Porches lit up by soft yellow bulbs, a flag on a pole in someone's yard hanging almost still. I parked on the street instead of the driveway out of habit and stepped out with my hands deep in my jacket pockets. Inside, the house smelled like roasted chicken and sweet tea, and the kind of forced comfort that only exists when people are trying to pretend nothing is wrong. Voices drifted from the dining room, laughter that sounded practiced. I walked in and the room shifted around me the way it always did. Aunt Linda looked up first. "There you are." Uncle Mark nodded like I was a late employee. Evan smirked from his seat. Richard stood by the counter with his shoulders squared, wearing casual clothes that still looked like a uniform on him. My mother, Marianne, was at the table, folding napkins with careful fingers. She looked up and then down again too quickly. I saw it right away. Her hands were trembling slightly. Not shaking enough for anyone to comment, just enough for me to know she had been holding herself still for too long. I greeted everyone the way I had learned to, simple, polite, no extra warmth. Richard answered with silence for half a beat, and then with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "You made it," he said, like he had approved my arrival. Dinner was already set, plates aligned, silverware placed with precision. It felt less like a family meal and more like an inspection line. I took a seat near the end of the table where I could see the room and where I could get up without asking anyone to move. Evan leaned toward Aunt Linda as if I was not there and said it loud enough for me to hear. "She's just enlisted." The words landed like a small slap. Not loud, not dramatic, just casual disrespect. Aunt Linda gave a little laugh. "Well, he said it like it was a fact, not an insult." Richard did not correct him. He never corrected people when they were useful to him. Uncle Mark glanced at me and then away. I kept my face neutral. I had learned long ago that giving them a reaction was the same as giving them permission. The next line came before the plates were even passed. "You're not officer material," Evan added with that same easy tone, like he was commenting on the weather, like my entire life could be measured by what he thought I looked like from across a table. He looked at Richard when he said it, seeking approval. Richard took a slow sip of sweet tea and then nodded once. It was so small you could miss it, but I saw it. My mother's fingers tightened around a napkin. She kept her eyes down. Aunt Linda shook her head like she was sympathetic. "It's okay, honey," she said to me. "Not everyone is cut out for leadership." The room hummed with that quiet agreement people offer when they want to feel kind without changing anything. I watched my mother's hands again. They were still trembling. I felt a familiar ache behind my ribs. Not anger, something heavier, a grief that had nowhere to go. I did not speak. I shifted my chair slightly, and then stood up as if to help with plates. It gave me an excuse to move closer to my mother. I placed myself between her and Richard without announcing it. Not a confrontation, just a change in angle. When Richard looked toward her, his gaze had to pass over me first. My mother glanced up for a second, and I saw relief flicker there before she buried it again. That was my value in that room. Not to win an argument, to reduce the pressure on the person who had been carrying it for years. Dinner continued with the kind of small talk that always came before the real blows. Richard asked about work without actually asking. "Still doing your little job," he said. Evan laughed. Aunt Linda smiled. Then the third step in their ladder came. "She's lucky we let her come," Uncle Mark said, as if he was talking about a guest who might misbehave. He did not mean it cruelly. That was the problem. He meant it the way people repeat rules they have accepted as normal. I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my eyes calm. I did not correct him. I did not need to. The fourth step arrived right on schedule, and it came from Richard this time. He set his fork down and looked at me like he was about to deliver guidance. "If Captain says you're done, you're done." He said it slowly and let the title sit in the air. Captain. Like it was a family name. Like it gave him jurisdiction over my life. Evan leaned back and watched me for a reaction. My mother's hands froze. Her fingers were white around the napkin. I could almost hear her breathing change. I kept my voice low when I finally spoke. Not to argue, just to respond in the smallest way possible. "I'm here for dinner," I said. That was all. Richard smiled like I had just admitted I needed his permission. A beat of silence passed, and then a cousin I barely saw anymore tried to lighten the mood. "Hayes, you still at Liberty?" The question was innocent, but the word liberty had weight. I looked at him and answered the truth without giving away anything. "Near it," I said. I did not add details. I did not name a unit. I did not say what I did. The cousin nodded, confused by how careful I was. Evan rolled his eyes. Richard watched me the way a man watches someone he thinks is hiding something he is entitled to know. "You're always so private," he said, like it was a flaw, like my restraint offended him. He leaned forward and lowered his voice, just enough to make it feel like a warning. "Later tonight, I'm going to introduce someone from command, someone who can explain how things really work." Aunt Linda looked impressed. Uncle Mark straightened in his chair. Evan grinned like Christmas had come early. My mother's eyes flicked up and then down again. I felt the cold steadiness settle in my chest. He was bluffing. I knew it, the way you know the sky is about to rain. It was not intuition. It was pattern recognition. Richard loved the idea of command. He loved saying the word. He loved being seen as connected. But he could not introduce what he did not control. I lifted a plate from the table and carried it to the counter to keep my hands busy. I moved again, so my body stayed between him and my mother. I heard Evan whisper something to Aunt Linda, and her laugh was sharp and quick. The room felt smaller by the minute. Richard kept talking. He kept leaning on his title. He kept building his own story. And I let him, because I knew the system he trusted did not work the way he believed it did. And when the moment came, his words would be the evidence that did him in. The air shifted after Richard said he would introduce someone from command later that night, and everyone leaned into that promise like it was entertainment. I felt the pressure build in my chest, the way it does when a room is waiting for you to break. I did not. I focused on the small, ordinary things, the scrape of a chair leg, the clink of a fork, the clock ticking above the doorway. Richard stood and raised his glass like he was about to offer a toast. Instead, he set it down and spoke in the same measured tone he used when he wanted his words to sound official. From now on, you do not step on base until I say so." The sentence landed hard. It was not shouted. It did not need to be. It was framed like a decision already approved. Aunt Linda inhaled sharply. Uncle Mark nodded once, like this made sense. Evan grinned and leaned back with his arms crossed. My mother's hands froze in her lap. I felt my pulse slow. That was the moment he crossed from implication to declaration. He went on without pause. "You have embarrassed this family long enough. Until you learn how to conduct yourself, you will not use my name or my connections." He looked around the table to make sure everyone was listening. He wanted witnesses. He wanted agreement. He wanted control to feel public. I said nothing. I reached for my phone instead and unlocked it quietly. I opened my notes app and started a new entry. I typed the date and time. I typed where I was. I typed who was present. I typed his words as close to exact as I could remember them. I did not look up while I did it. I had learned that writing things down was not passive. It was preparation. Richard mistook my silence for compliance and escalated. He stepped toward the counter and picked up the car keys he had placed there earlier like a prize. "Insurance is under my policy," he said. "That ends tonight." He dropped the keys into his pocket. "You can find another way to get around until you earn back trust." Evan laughed and said, "Guess you will be walking." Aunt Linda offered a thin smile. "That is probably for the best," she said. "Keeps things simple." My mother looked up then and opened her mouth like she might say something, but Richard cut her off without turning his head. "We are talking about safety, Marianne. You know that." She closed her mouth and looked back down at her hands. I felt something tighten behind my eyes, but I did not let it surface. I typed again. Cut insurance. Took keys. Witnesses present. Richard was not finished. He moved to the cabinet by the wall and opened it like he was proving a point. "Your mother's documents are kept here," he said casually. "House papers, bills, everything important. Until this situation is resolved, those stay with me." He smiled when he said it, like he was being generous. My stomach clenched. That was not about me. That was about keeping her afraid. He turned back to me and tilted his head. "And if you decide to make this difficult, I can always request a welfare check. You have been under stress, living on your own. Who knows how you are really doing?" The word welfare was soft in his mouth. It sounded helpful. It was not. Evan's smile faltered for a second and then returned. Aunt Linda frowned like she was unsure if this was still a joke. Uncle Mark shifted in his chair. I finished typing and locked my phone. I placed it face down on the counter and folded my hands together. I kept my voice level when I finally spoke. "I am here for dinner," I said again. That was all. Richard shook his head slowly like I had disappointed him. "You see," he said to the table, "this is what I am dealing with. No respect, no understanding of consequences." He reached for his phone again and unlocked it with a practiced swipe. He typed with his thumbs while he talked. "This could all be avoided if you would just listen." He glanced at the screen and then at me and smiled. "Watch how fast the system listens to a captain." He held the phone loosely in his hand like a prop. I did not look at it. I did not ask who he was messaging. I did not challenge him. I reopened my notes app and added another line. Threatened welfare check. Claimed authority to restrict base access. Used title in family setting. Witnesses present. I included names. I included times. I included the exact phrasing he used. This was not about revenge. It was about accuracy. I knew that anyone who read this later would care less about how I felt, and more about what was said. And where? Richard slipped his phone back into his pocket and leaned against the counter. There was a satisfaction in his posture now. He believed the matter was settled. Evan leaned toward me and whispered, "You should just do what he says." I ignored him. Aunt Linda cleared her throat and said, "Maybe everyone should calm down." Uncle Mark suggested dessert. My mother remained silent. I stepped closer to her under the pretense of clearing plates and stood so my shoulder blocked Richard's line of sight to her face. I could feel her breathing change. I could feel the room tighten. I did not argue because arguments feed people like Richard. I did not explain because explanations give them something to twist. I documented. I timestamped. I let witnesses sit with their own discomfort. If you have ever had someone try to control you with paperwork, hit like so I know I am not alone. Richard watched me closely, like he was waiting for me to crack. I met his eyes once and then looked away. Not in fear, in dismissal. He did not recognize it as such. He smiled again and said nothing more. The threat hung in the air between us, like something that could still be taken back if I apologized. I did not. I knew this was the part where he thought he had closed the door. He did not realize he had just opened a file that would not close easily. I excused myself from the table without making it a scene and walked down the hallway toward my old room, while the sound of silverware and forced conversation continued behind me, like nothing had happened. The door closed softly at my back, and the house felt different immediately. Quieter, heavier, like the walls remembered everything, even if the people pretended not to. My room had not changed much. Same narrow bed, same dresser with a chipped corner, same small desk by the window. I stood there for a moment and let my breathing settle. This was not the part where I confronted anyone. This was the part where I decided whether I was willing to pay the price of doing this the right way. I opened the bottom drawer of the desk and pulled out a thin binder wrapped in a plain manila cover. No labels, no markings. Inside were things I never showed anyone. Not because they were secret in a dramatic way, but because they were procedural, orderly, boring to anyone who did not know what they meant. The first page was a contact list written in block letters. First Sergeant Morales at the top. Not a personal number, a duty line. I'd written it down the day he told me to always have it somewhere you could reach without thinking. Under that were notes I'd copied by hand months earlier. What to do if someone misuses rank. Steps. Do not escalate verbally. Document exact language. Note time and witnesses. Notify chain through proper channels. Do not accuse. State facts. Request guidance. I sat on the edge of the bed and rested the binder on my knees. The weight of it felt heavier than it should have. I thought about what Richard had just done. He did not raise his voice. He did not touch me. He used his title like a tool and assumed it would work because it always had at home. He brought rank into a family space. He issued a restriction he did not have authority to issue. He threatened to use systems meant for protection as leverage. If I said nothing and walked away, he would do it again. Maybe to me. Definitely to my mother. I did not want to pull the system into my family. I never had. But he already had. He made it unavoidable. I took out my phone and opened a new message. I did not include emotion. I did not include background. I wrote the way I had been trained to write. Clear, minimal, factual. Sir, this is Hayes. I am at my mother's residence. An off-duty family member with rank issued a verbal restriction regarding base access and threatened use of welfare check and control of insurance and documents. Witnesses present. Request guidance on next steps. I paused before sending it. This was the moment where everything could tilt the wrong way if I misjudged it, if I was wrong. if I misunderstood, if I overreacted. I thought about the first rule I learned in uniform. Paperwork matters, not feelings. I pressed send. The phone felt hot in my hand. I set it down on the desk, face up, and waited. The house was quiet now. I could hear the murmur of voices from the dining room, but the words did not reach me. I looked around the room and remembered being 15 and standing in this same spot, signing a sheet of paper labeled House Rules, like it was a contract. I remembered thinking even then that rules without authority were just control dressed up as order. The phone vibrated once. I did not pick it up immediately. I took a breath, then another. Then I looked. Stay put, do not engage, I am calling. The message was from First Sergeant Morales. No punctuation, no extra words. The kind of response that carried weight because of how little it said. I felt something loosen in my chest that I had been holding tight for years. Not relief, permission. I put the phone back down and closed the binder. I slid it into the drawer and stood up. I did not go back to the table. I did not announce anything. I leaned against the wall near my door, where I could hear the house but not be seen. My thoughts slowed. I ran through what could happen next. Best case, someone explained to Richard quietly that he had overstepped and he backed down. Worst case, he doubled down and tried to pull more people into it. Either way, I had done what I was supposed to do. I had not yelled, I had not threatened. I had not used my own position to intimidate. I had let the system speak. The price was still there. If this went sideways, it would be my name on a report, my conduct under review, my judgment questioned. I had earned everything I had by being careful. This was the most careful thing I could do. I heard laughter from the dining room again. Evan said something and Richard responded with a chuckle. He sounded relaxed, confident. He believed he had already won. I stayed where I was. I did not explain to my mother what I had done. I did not owe anyone an explanation yet. The only thing that mattered was that the right people had the facts. The doorbell rang. The sound cut through the house like a clean line. Voices stopped. Chairs scraped. Someone said, "Did you invite anyone?" Another voice answered, "No." Footsteps moved toward the front door. I pushed myself off the wall and stepped into the hallway. My pulse picked up, but my hands were steady. The bell rang again. Short, firm, the kind of ring that expects an answer. From the dining room, I heard Richard say, "Probably someone from the neighborhood." He sounded almost amused. I knew better. This was the moment. I did not rush. I walked at a normal pace toward the front of the house. My mother appeared at the end of the hallway, looking confused and afraid. I met her eyes and gave a small nod. Not reassurance, just presence. The door opened and voices filled the entryway. Calm, professional, the kind of voices that did not raise themselves to be heard. From where I stood, I could not see who it was yet, but I knew what it meant. I straightened my shoulders and waited. The entryway filled with cold air when the front door opened, and for a second, the porch light washed the faces of everyone standing there in a flat white glow. 2 uniforms, one darker coat over a dress uniform. The posture told the story before the names did. Major Hall stood slightly forward, with Captain Wynne half a step behind and to the side. They looked like they had been in the middle of something else and changed course without fuss. No dramatic arrival, no raised voices, just presence. My mother froze near the hallway. Aunt Linda stepped out of the dining room, with her hands still damp from touching dishes. Uncle Mark appeared behind her, like he did not know whether to be impressed or afraid. Evan leaned around the corner trying to see and smiling like he expected a show. Richard moved into the entryway fast and straightened his shoulders so hard his chin lifted. This was his element. An audience. A reason to perform. He took one step forward, and his voice changed into his on-duty tone. "Major, Captain, welcome." He extended his hand as if he owned the doorway. I stayed still near the hallway opening, where I could see everything. I kept my arms at my sides. My heart was beating fast, but my face was calm. Major Hall did not take Richard's hand right away. That was the first crack. A tiny pause that lasted maybe 2 seconds, but felt like someone had turned down the volume in the entire house. Major Hall's eyes moved past Richard to me. Not scanning, not searching, settling. It was the kind of look you give someone you already know how to place in a room. The kind of look that says, "I see you, and I know your lane." Richard's hand hovered awkwardly in the air. Aunt Linda's smile faltered. Uncle Mark swallowed. Evan's grin tightened. My mother's hands rose to her chest as if she needed to hold herself together. Major Hall spoke without stepping fully inside. "Evening, Hayes. Step with me, ma'am." He said it the way you say a name you have already said in professional spaces. Not loud, not soft, simply correct. The word "ma'am" landed like a weight on the floorboards. The room broke in half in silence. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed the same way. Richard blinked once like he had misheard. Evan's mouth opened slightly and then shut. Aunt Linda's eyes darted to Richard, and then back to me. Uncle Mark's face went pale. My mother made a small sound and pressed her lips together as if she was trying not to cry. I did not move right away, not because I was shocked, but because I wanted to keep everything steady. This was not a victory lap. This was a system doing what it does when it is asked to respond. Major Hall's gaze stayed on me. Captain Wynne nodded once in a polite, restrained way. I stepped forward at a normal pace and stopped at the edge of the entryway. I did not look at Richard. I did not need to. The loss of his footing was audible in the way his breath caught. He tried to recover by turning it into a normal greeting. "Sir, I did not know you were coming. I am Captain Hale." He said it louder than necessary. He angled his body to block my path, like he could reclaim control with positioning. Major Hall did not shift. He did not raise his voice. He did not even change his expression. He looked at Richard the way you look at a subordinate who has missed the point. "Captain Hale," he said evenly. Then his eyes returned to me. "Hayes, with me." That was it. No title for Richard, no handshake, no validation, just direction. The difference was the message. Authority does not announce itself. It is recognized. Richard's jaw tightened. His pride flared in his eyes. He tried again. "Sir, there must be some misunderstanding. This is a family matter." Major Hall took one step into the house then, and the space adjusted around him like the air had to make room. Captain Wynne followed just enough to make it clear he was not alone. Major Hall's voice stayed level. "Not here. Not like this." Richard's mouth opened, and nothing came out. The dining room behind us felt suddenly far away, even though it was only a few steps. Plates sat half-cleared, the smell of roasted chicken mixed with the sharp, clean scent of cold night air. The wall clock kept ticking. The little flag on the shelf by the doorway looked cheap and decorative, now like a prop someone forgot to put away. I could see Aunt Linda's hands trembling. I could see Uncle Mark holding his breath. Evan looked from Richard to Major Hall like a kid who just realized the rules had changed and nobody told him. My mother stared at me with a look I had never seen on her face before. Not fear, not guilt. Hope. A thin, fragile hope like a candle in a draft. Major Hall turned slightly toward me and angled his head toward the porch. "Step outside with me, ma'am." His tone was not harsh. It was efficient. It was also careful, like he knew this was a family home and he was not here to create a scene. Richard moved as if to follow. "Sir, I need to know what this is about." Major Hall did not look at him. Captain Wynne did. His eyes were calm and firm. "Captain, this is not your lane." He said it softly, but it carried. Richard stiffened like he had been struck. Aunt Linda made a small gasp. Uncle Mark looked down at the floor. Evan's grin disappeared entirely. I took one more step forward and passed Richard without touching him. The hallway was narrow, and I felt the heat of his anger as I moved by, but I did not let it pull me. I stepped onto the porch. The night air hit my face. Major Hall followed and stood beside the railing. Captain Wynne remained near the doorway, where he could see into the house and keep the space controlled. Major Hall spoke in a low voice meant for me, not for the room, not for the family, for the situation. "You contacted First Sergeant Morales," he said. I nodded once. I kept my hands relaxed at my sides. "Yes, sir." Major Hall's eyes narrowed slightly in a way that suggested he was confirming details, not questioning my integrity. "You are safe right now. Do not engage further." "Understood." I said yes, sir, again. Behind us, inside the doorway, I could hear Richard shifting and trying to speak. His voice came out strained. "Sir, I have been trying to correct a discipline issue. She is being disrespectful." Major Hall did not respond to him. He did not feed the performance. He turned to look at me again. Evening haze. He said my name a second time, like it mattered that the record was clear. "Step with me, ma'am." I understood. This was not about making Richard look small. It was about moving the conversation where it belonged. Away from witnesses. Away from the family table. Away from his stage. But the damage to his stage was already done. They had seen it. They had seen a major walk past a captain in his own house and address me first. They had seen Richard's authority fail to fill the room. They had seen the shift in real time. Comment your city if you have ever watched power shift in real time. I followed Major Hall down the porch steps and toward the driveway. My mother appeared behind Captain Wynne in the doorway, and she held one hand to her mouth. Her eyes were wet. She looked at Richard like she was seeing him for the first time. Richard stood stiff in the entryway, with his fist clenched at his sides. Evan hovered behind him, suddenly quiet. Aunt Linda and Uncle Mark stood frozen near the dining room, like statues left out after the music stops. Richard finally found his words again and pushed them out like he could force the moment back into his control. Sir Major Hall turned his head just enough for Richard to see his profile. Major Hall spoke the way leaders speak when they are confirming facts that already have a file attached. "Are you still on that tasking?" The question was simple. It was not curiosity. It was placement. I answered the same way I had been trained to answer. "Yes, sir." Major Hall nodded once. He did not ask what tasking. He did not ask for details. That was the point. He did not need any threats tied to your duties or access. I did not add emotion. I did not list everything he had said. I gave the minimum necessary. Verbal restriction asserted. Threats of welfare check and interference with transportation and documents. Witnesses present. Major Hall exhaled slowly through his nose. He turned his head toward the porch where Captain Wynne stood near the doorway, keeping the boundary between the house and the conversation. Captain Wynne met his eyes and nodded. That was all the coordination they needed. Major Hall did not say, "You are right." He did not say, "Richard is wrong." He did not have to. The way he moved was the message. He stepped back toward the porch with me beside him, and his posture stayed composed. As we approached the entryway, Captain Wynne shifted slightly. Evan hovered behind him, now quiet and watchful. Aunt Linda and Uncle Mark had drifted closer, but stayed at a distance, like they knew they were not supposed to be part of this, and could not stop themselves anyway. My mother stood near the hallway with her hands clasped tight against her chest. Her eyes moved between me and Major Hall, like she was trying to understand a new language. Captain Wynne kept his voice controlled when he addressed Richard. "Captain, this is not your lane." The sentence was not an insult. It was a boundary. It hit Richard harder than any shouting could have. Richard tried to straighten even more. "Sir, I am simply maintaining discipline in my household." Captain Wynne did not react to the word household. He did not let Richard frame it that way. He glanced briefly at Major Hall and then looked back at Richard. "You asserted restrictions you do not have authority to assert. You made contact attempts outside appropriate channels. Stop." Richard's face flushed. He looked around the room and realized he had an audience that no longer supported him. Aunt Linda's smile was gone. Uncle Mark's eyes were fixed on the floor. Evan looked confused, like he had expected the uniforms to validate his father, and instead they were cutting him down with calm words. Richard tried to pivot. "I have connections. I know people. I was just making a call." Major Hall stepped forward and spoke the first words he had directed at Richard since the doorway. "Captain Hale." He did not use a first name. He did not offer a handshake. He did not raise his voice. "This discussion will move through proper channels. Not here. Not in this home." Richard opened his mouth and then closed it. He looked at me then, with a flash of anger, as if I had orchestrated this to humiliate him. I did not look back. I kept my eyes forward. I felt my mother's gaze on my shoulder like she wanted to reach for me, but did not know if she was allowed. Captain Wynne turned slightly, as if speaking to Major Hall, but his words were angled so Richard could hear. "Use her proper designation." He did not say the designation out loud. He did not say a call sign. He did not need to. The effect was immediate. Richard's expression changed. Confusion first, then fear, because he understood what that sentence implied, even if he did not know the details. It meant I was not just a random enlisted daughter he could push around at a dinner table. It meant there was a professional identity attached to my name that lived in a lane he did not have access to. Evan looked at me again, and for the first time, he did not smirk. He studied me like he was trying to solve a puzzle and realizing the pieces were missing. Aunt Linda's lips parted slightly. Uncle Mark finally looked up, and his eyes were wide. My mother's breath caught. I could hear it, a small, sharp inhale. Major Hall turned his head toward me again, and his tone softened a fraction while staying formal. "Hayes, you will not discuss your duties here." "Understood. Yes, sir." He nodded once. Then he spoke to Captain Wynne in a low voice. "Coordinate with First Sergeant Morales. Document what was stated and who was present." Captain Wynne nodded. Richard took a step forward, like he could still argue his way out. "Sir, I have done nothing wrong. I am a captain." Major Hall looked at him steadily. "Your rank does not extend into improper contact. It does not authorize you to interfere with someone else's tasking. It does not shield you from review." The word review hung in the air like a door closing. Richard's face went tight. Evan swallowed. Aunt Linda's hands twisted together. Uncle Mark shifted his weight like he wanted to leave. My mother stared at Richard with a look that was part fear and part dawning realization. I stood there and felt something inside me loosen. Not triumph, not joy, a release. Like my lungs had been holding air for years and only now remembered how to breathe out fully. For the first time in a long time, I felt safe, not because I was protected by a title, Because the system was doing what it was designed to do when someone tried to misuse it. Major Hall stepped back toward the doorway. "We are done for tonight," he said. "Captain Hale, do not contact anyone regarding this outside proper channels. Hayes, you will return to your location and remain available through your chain." "Yes, sir," I said. Richard's eyes flicked to my mother, as if searching for support. She did not move. She did not speak. Her silence was different now. It was not surrender. It was distance. Richard turned back to Major Hall with his voice strained. "Sir, I was only trying to help." Major Hall's reply was short. "Not like this." Captain Wynne held Richard's gaze one last time. "Captain, you created a situation for yourself." Then he stepped aside as Major Hall and I moved toward the door. Richard stood in his own foyer, staring at the space where control used to work. He finally understood what he had done. He had tried to use rank as a weapon at a family table, and in doing so, he had put his own conduct under the light. He had made a call. He had made threats. He had demanded the system listen to a captain. Now the system was listening, just not the way he wanted. I left my mother's house the same way I had arrived, without drama, without a final speech, without looking back to see who was watching. The porch light faded behind me as I walked to my car on the street, and the night air felt sharper now, like it could cut through whatever was left of my old fear. I drove back toward my place near Fort Liberty, with my phone on the seat beside me and my notes still open in my mind, like a file that needed to be closed properly. I did not feel happy. I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired in a deep, clean way, like a weight had been moved from one shelf to another, and my body was realizing how long it had carried it. When I got home, I sat at my small kitchen table and opened my phone again. I read my log. Date, time, location names, present exact quotes. I added one more entry for the doorbell and the arrival of Major Hall and Captain Wynne. I wrote it in plain words, without emotion. I saved it. I backed it up. Then I stopped. The rest was not mine to force. That was the point. Let the system speak meant letting it do the slow, unglamorous part too. The next day, the shift happened quietly. No sirens, no public announcement. Just messages and scheduled times and the kind of language that sounds dull unless you understand how much it can change. I received a short update through my chain. There would be a command-directed counseling for an off-duty conduct issue involving alleged misuse of rank and improper contact attempts. My name was not attached to it as an accusation. It was attached as a reporting fact and a protected lane. That mattered. For people outside the military, it might have sounded small. For people who have served, it was real. It meant the unit would look at what happened. It meant someone would ask questions. It meant Richard could not pretend this was just family drama anymore. He would have to face it inside the structure he claimed to represent. A day later, Richard was required to report for a meeting with his chain of command. It was not optional. It was not a conversation he could charm his way out of at a dinner table. It was the kind of meeting where you sit down and you listen, and you answer what you are asked. It was the kind of meeting where no one cares how offended you feel, and everyone cares what you did. I did not attend. I did not request to attend. That was never my goal. My role was simple and strict. Provide documentation when requested. Stay available. Do not engage. I followed that. When a request came to confirm the exact language used and the presence of witnesses, I forwarded my time-stamped notes and offered names of the people at the table. Aunt Linda, Uncle Mark, Evan, Marianne. I did not add commentary. I did not write a paragraph about my childhood. I did not talk about my feelings. I did not call Richard a monster. I wrote what I knew, and only what I knew. That was my restraint, and it was also my strength. People like Richard expect emotional reactions because emotions are easier to dismiss. Facts are harder. The system moved in the way it was designed to. Not cruel, not vengeful. Corrective, proportional. There was a flagging action appropriate for the allegation and the context. It was not a career-ending hammer. It was a pause and a review. It was a record that said, this behavior is being examined. It was oversight. It was accountability. That is what veterans respect. Not humiliation. Not fantasy punishment. Just the right process applied to the right behavior. In the days after the meeting, my mother called me. Her voice was small. "Hayes, he is furious." I closed my eyes and listened. I could hear the house behind her, the faint clatter of something being set down too hard, the kind of sound I had learned to interpret as a warning. "He says you ruined him," she continued. "He says you went behind his back." I kept my tone low. I did not argue with my mother. I did not ask her to choose sides. Yet. I asked one question. "Is he safe to be around right now?" She hesitated. That pause said more than words. I heard her swallow. "He is not hitting anyone," she said quickly, like she needed to defend him, even as she feared him. "He is just yelling. He is slamming doors. He keeps saying you embarrassed him. He keeps saying he is a captain and the military should have listened to him." My stomach tightened, not because I felt guilty, but because I recognized the pattern. When control fails, it turns into blame. Richard could not blame the major. He could not blame the captain, who told him it was not his lane. He could not blame the process he claimed to love. So he blamed me. My mother's voice dropped lower. "He told me the system is only protecting you because you have some special status. He keeps asking what you are really doing. He keeps demanding you tell him." I let the silence stretch. Then I said the truth in the only way that was safe for both of us. "Mom, I cannot discuss my duties, and I will not be pulled into arguing about this in your house." She whispered, "He said you destroyed his career." I could hear her breathing quicken, like she was trying not to cry. Then she repeated his exact words. "That girl is destroying my career. She is sabotaging me. She is making me look like a fool." The words hit the air and stayed there. My mother sounded ashamed as she said them, like she knew how wrong they were, and still felt trapped under them. I did not gloat. I did not tell her he deserved it. I said something simpler. He did this to himself. The system is responding to what he chose to say and do. That is all. My mother was quiet. In that quiet, I could feel a shift beginning not in Richard, but in her. Because for the first time, there was a consequence in the world that did not bend around him. He could slam doors, he could threaten, he could insult, but he could not unring the bell. He had tried to use rank as a weapon, and now rank had become a mirror. The justice was not loud. It was orderly, and it was already changing everything inside that house. Richard came to find me 3 days later. Not in uniform, not at a base gate. He came to my mother's house like he owned the ground it sat on, and waited for me in the driveway, as if he were calling a meeting he expected me to attend. I had pulled up to check on my mother and saw him before I turned off the engine. His shoulders were slumped in a way I had never seen before. Not defeated exactly, but reduced. The confidence he usually wore like armor was gone. When I stepped out of the car, he straightened out of habit, then stopped himself and let it fall. "Hayes," he said my name carefully, as if testing a new tone. "We need to talk." I closed the car door and stood where I was, leaving space between us on purpose. He glanced toward the house, then back at me. His voice dropped. I didn't expect it to go this far. They're reviewing everything now. Counseling meetings, paperwork. You know how this works. He paused, waiting for me to react. I did not. He exhaled sharply. Just make one call. You know people. You clearly have pull. Make one call and tell them this was a misunderstanding, that I didn't mean it the way they took it. He took a step closer and lowered his voice again. You owe this family. The words were familiar. They were the same words he had used for years whenever he wanted obedience. I felt my jaw set, but my voice stayed level. I don't interfere with command decisions, and I don't negotiate my dignity. He flinched like I had struck him. You're being dramatic, he snapped, then caught himself and softened his tone again. Hayes, listen. You have no idea what this could cost me. Promotion boards, assignments. They could move me somewhere I don't want to go. You don't understand how much is on the line. I looked at him steadily. I understand exactly what is on the line, I said. You do too. He shook his head in frustration. This never would have happened if you hadn't run to them. There it was, the blame sliding back into place. You went behind my back. You embarrassed me. In my own house, in front of my family. I took a breath and spoke slowly. You brought rank into that house. You issued restrictions you do not have authority to issue. You threatened systems meant to protect people. I documented what you said. The system responded. He opened his mouth to interrupt me, and I raised my hand just enough to stop him. Not a threat, a boundary. I am not debating this. His eyes narrowed. You think you're better than me now. That's what this is. You think because they call you something special, you can look down on me. I did not answer the insult. I addressed the behavior. I did not ask for them to come. I asked for guidance. You escalated. He laughed bitterly. Guidance. You knew exactly what you were doing. You wanted to teach me a lesson. I shook my head once. No, I wanted it to stop. The word hung between us. Stop. Not punish, not destroy. Stop. He stared at me like he did not recognize the language. For years, he had relied on fear and pressure and authority borrowed from a uniform. Now, none of it worked. His voice dropped again. Hayes, please. Make one call. Just one. I'll fix things with your mother. I'll back off. You can keep doing whatever it is you do. I'll stay out of it. I studied his face. The promise sounded rehearsed, temporary, conditional. He was not asking for forgiveness. He was asking for control back. I answered the way I would answer anyone trying to pull me out of my lane. I don't interfere with command decisions, and I don't negotiate my dignity. He went still. For a moment, I thought he might explode. Instead, his shoulders sagged, and he looked past me toward the street. You don't know what you've done, he muttered. I know exactly what I've done, I said. I chose not to live under threats. He turned away from me sharply and walked back toward the house. Before he reached the door, he stopped and looked over his shoulder. You'll regret this. The words were automatic. Habit. They landed weakly and fell to the concrete between us. I did not respond. I watched him go inside and listened as the door shut harder than necessary. I stayed in the driveway for a moment longer, feeling the weight of the choice settle into something solid. This was the boundary. Not loud, not cruel, final. The consequences came quietly after that. Richard was required to complete the review process, counseling, documentation, oversight. The promotion window he had been eyeing closed, not permanently, but long enough to matter. He was reassigned to a position with less visibility, not a punishment out of proportion, a correction, a reminder that authority misused creates distance, not power. Inside the house, the tension escalated. My mother called me later that night with her voice shaking. "He is taking it out on us," she said. "Not physically, but the words, the blame. He keeps saying Evan is weak because of me. He keeps saying I should have controlled you." I listened. I did not rush in to fix it. I told her something I had never said before. "You do not have to absorb his anger." She was quiet. Then she whispered, "I don't know how to stop him." I answered honestly, "You start by saying no." The line went quiet. That silence was the sound of a breaking point getting close. If you believe boundaries are a form of respect, hit subscribe. Richard had tried to return with audacity, expecting me to save him the way I had spent years surviving him. I had refused, without cruelty. And now the pressure he used to aim at me was cracking the space around him. The system had done its part. Mine was finished. The house felt quieter after Richard stopped coming home on time. Not peaceful, just emptied of the noise that had filled every corner for years. I went back a week later at my mother's request, and we sat at the small kitchen table where so many arguments had ended without resolution. The light through the window was thin and winter pale. My mother wrapped her hands around a mug and stared at the surface like it might tell her what to say. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and careful. "I was afraid," she said. "Not of him hurting me in one moment. Of being alone. Of being the woman people pity. Of starting over when everyone already knows your name." She paused and swallowed, and I was afraid of men in uniform because I thought they were the only ones who could keep the world from falling apart. The words landed heavy, but honest. I listened without interrupting. I had learned that truth needs space. She kept going. "I thought if I kept the peace long enough, it would become real peace. I thought if I didn't provoke him, he would soften. I thought if I stayed quiet, you would be safe." Her eyes finally lifted to mine. "I failed you." I shook my head once and leaned forward just enough for her to feel my presence without pressure. "I am not angry with you," I said. Then I said the only sentence that mattered. "Mom, I am done living under fear." The words were not sharp. They were firm. She nodded slowly like she was testing them for weight. We sat there for a moment and let the quiet settle into something different. Not silence born of avoidance, silence born of decision. Then we talked about practical things, because healing without structure turns back into fear. We wrote a list on a yellow pad. Open a separate account in her name only. Move a small amount first, enough to feel the door open. Lock the important papers in a place Richard could not access. Birth certificates, insurance documents, house paperwork. I showed her how to make copies and where to keep them. I explained documentation the way I always do. Dates, times, exact words, witnesses. Not to punish, to protect. She listened carefully and asked questions. Her shoulders lowered a little as we worked. I slid a piece of paper across the table with a local number on it, a domestic violence hotline in the county. I did not lecture. I did not dramatize. I said, "This is support, not a sentence. You call when you need to talk to someone who will not tell you to keep the peace." She stared at the number for a long time, then folded the paper and put it in her pocket. "Thank you," she whispered. Not for rescuing her, for respecting her. The days that followed were not clean. Richard's anger did not disappear. It redirected. He accused her of betrayal. He accused Evan of weakness. He accused the system of targeting him. But something had changed. My mother no longer tried to absorb it all. She began to step away when his voice rose. She stopped apologizing for things she did not do. She kept her keys on her own ring. She opened the account and checked it twice a day, like it was proof she could stand on her own feet. Evan grew quieter. The jokes stopped. The smirks faded. He watched the balance of the house tilt and did not know where to stand. One evening, I came by to pick up a box of old photos and heard raised voices from the living room. I stayed near the hallway and listened without entering. Richard was pacing. He was loud but careful not to cross a line he knew others were watching now. He said, "Your daughter ruined everything." My mother answered in a voice I had never heard from her before. Calm, clear. No more. The words were simple. They stopped him mid-sentence. He scoffed and tried to laugh it off. "You don't mean that." She repeated it. No more. She did not explain. She did not justify. She did not raise her voice. She set the boundary and let it stand. Richard looked around the room as if searching for an ally, and found none. He stormed out. The doors slammed. The house stayed still. My mother stood there with her hands at her sides, breathing fast, then slow. She looked at me, and her eyes filled. "I am scared," she said. I nodded. Me too. We let the fear exist without letting it decide. Over the next weeks, the healing was practical and uneven. We scheduled a consult with a local counselor. We learned about safety planning without panic. We made sure neighbors knew to call if they heard shouting. We put important numbers on speed dial. We practiced saying no without apology. Boundaries, documentation support. Not slogans, tools. This is what I wanted people to see. Not a fairy tale ending. A workable one. Richard's consequences continued to move through channels without my involvement. Reviews take time. Distance does its own work. I focused on my duties and on making sure my mother was not alone with the fallout. When she doubted herself, I reminded her that peace built on fear is not peace. When she wavered, I stood beside her without stepping in front of her. That mattered. One night she called me and said I slept through the night. No shouting, no waiting for footsteps, just sleep. I sat on my couch and let that land. The weight in my chest eased another notch. Healing did not arrive as relief. It arrived as function, as the ability to breathe and plan and say no. As a woman standing in her own kitchen and choosing herself. The house would not become quiet overnight, but it was no longer ruled by fear, and that was enough to begin. The first morning I returned fully to routine after everything happened, I did what I always do. I woke before my alarm. I made coffee. I checked my boots out of habit, even though I was not wearing them yet. The world outside my window was quiet and gray and ordinary. That was the point. Real change rarely looks dramatic up close. It looks like a person showing up anyway. At the unit, the day moved with familiar rhythm. Vehicles in the lot, people walking with folders tucked under arms, a few quick greetings. No one asked about my family dinner. No one needed to. The system does not run on gossip. It runs on lanes. I stepped into the office space assigned for the inspection support work, and the fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. A bulletin board held timelines and task lists. A whiteboard had names and dates written in neat block letters. I hung my jacket and took my seat at the table. A staff NCO entered, carrying a stack of folders and a clipboard. He paused when he saw me and nodded once. Morning. Then his tone shifted slightly into that professional cadence used when things matter. He set the folders down and said the words that made the final piece click for anyone watching. Designation. He did not say it loud. He did not say it for show. He said it like a normal part of the day. Use her proper designation. I heard Captain Wynn's voice in my memory and felt that same quiet steadiness in my chest. The NCO slid a folder toward me and added my call sign the way you add a last name to make sure the right person is receiving the right tasking. It was brief, clean, no explanation offered, no permission requested, just recognition. I opened the folder and scanned the contents: a readiness checklist, a set of inspection notes, a memo draft needing signature and routing. The work was not exciting. It was careful. It was the kind of work that prevents bigger failures later. The kind of work that keeps people safe without anyone applauding. Another person stepped in, a junior officer with a weary face and a coffee cup. He glanced at me and nodded respectfully. He did not ask who I was. He already knew the lane. He pointed at the board and said, "We are pushing the timeline. Can you validate this section before the brief?" I nodded once. Yes. That was it. No speeches, no rank flexing, no drama. Just responsibility moving through the right hands. I picked up a pen and signed the inspection memo where I was supposed to sign. I initialed the checklist. I wrote one short note in the margin. Clarify discrepancy, verify roster, confirm training date. Then I passed it back across the table, the same way it had been passed to me. The reveal was not a spotlight. It was a small professional moment that explained everything about why Richard's little performance at the dinner table had failed. My authority did not come from shouting or intimidation. It came from trust earned through quiet competence and protected by a system that knows how to recognize it. That was the secret. Not a fantasy unit, not some unbelievable power, a need-to-know role that mattered because it was real. The day continued. A brief in a small room with people standing along the walls, a timeline review, a reminder about proper channels. No one mentioned Richard. No one needed to. In my mother's house, he had tried to wear his rank like a crown. Here, rank was simply a tool with rules around it. When those rules are broken, the system responds. When they are followed, the system runs smoothly and no one has to beg for respect. Later that week, I visited my mother again. The house felt lighter. Not perfect, but different. My mother had her own keys, her own folder of documents in a locked box, a new bank app on her phone, a small note on the fridge that read, "Boundaries," in her handwriting. Richard was not there when I arrived. Evan was in the living room, watching television without speaking. He looked up and then looked down again. No smirk, no jokes, just a boy who had grown up under someone else's shadow and was now forced to see it for what it was. My mother and I sat at the kitchen table and talked about ordinary things: work, groceries, weather. The kind of talk that used to be impossible because fear filled every quiet space. Before I left, she touched my hand and said, "I thought strength meant staying. I see now strength is choosing." I squeezed her hand once and stood. On the drive back, I thought about everything Richard had done and everything the system had done in response. I thought about how authority is supposed to function. In my mother's house, Richard used rank to control people who could not challenge him. That was not strength. Rank used at home is not strength. It is insecurity. Real authority does not shout. It is recognized. It shows up in a quiet room when a major pauses before shaking a captain's hand and addresses the right person first. It shows up when a calm voice says, "This is not your lane," and everyone understands what that means. It shows up when someone signs a checklist and keeps the machine honest. Months from now, Richard might still tell his version of the story. He might still blame me. He might still insist he was wronged. But the record would exist. The system would remember. And my mother would have a life not built around his moods. My life would continue in the lane I earned. The ending was not fireworks. It was peace that had paperwork behind it. It was a quiet kitchen where my mother could breathe. It was a workplace where my name was spoken with the right respect without me asking for it. If this story hit close to home, tell me one word you needed to hear today.